They came to the forest as masters and decided that the old man living in a treehouse would not be able to stop them. But one detail changed everything. He knew every inch of that forest. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The first light of morning always reached the high valleys long before it touched the cabin of Thomas Gray. The old man liked it that way. He preferred waking not to brightness, but to the slow, almost hesitant grayness that settled over the forest, like a quiet promise of another day. Thomas rose as he always did, long before the sun would warm the air, long before the birds regained their voices. He swung his legs from the bed with the practiced patience of age, and for a moment listened to the familiar creaks of the timber walls around him. He knew each one by sound, the way some men know the rhythm of their own breathing. He rubbed his hands, stiff from the cold and from years of work, and stood with a sigh that rustled in the silence. He made his simple breakfast oatmeal, water, a single cup of coffee brewed over the small wood stove, the smell of pine smoke mixed with the aroma of roasted beans, faint but comforting. At 72, he did not chase comfort, but he appreciated the kind that arrived quietly, without asking for attention. As he ate, he looked through the window, toward the dark shapes of the old trees. They stood tall against the paling sky, hulking silhouettes of the world he had chosen to live in. For nearly 20 years he had woken to the same picture. The forest, the wind brushing the tops of the pines, the slow settling of morning frost, the stillness of land that belonged to no one. Thomas liked the forest more than he liked people. People asked questions. People made demands. People remembered things he spent his life trying to forget. But the forest simply was. It held its secrets, its scars, its ghosts, and never asked him to explain his own. It had saved him, in a way, or at least it had given him a place to disappear, which was the closest thing to salvation he had ever hoped for. He stepped outside, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. The ground crackled beneath his boots, thin frost breaking like sugar under his weight. Far above, the sky lightened from slate to pale blue. He waited a long moment, breathing in the air, tasting the quiet. Then, with slow, steady steps, he walked toward the hidden path that led not to the forest floor, but upward. The trail twisted between thick trunks, disappearing behind fallen branches and moss-covered rocks. Most people would never notice it. Thomas had built it that way. He ducked beneath a leaning oak branch, brushed aside low boughs, and reached the third tree on the left, an enormous ancient pine with bark thick as armor. He placed his hand against it as he did every morning, acknowledging the tree like an old friend. The footholds he had carved decades ago were still there, worn smooth by years of use. He climbed slowly, but with practiced ease. Age made him careful, not weak. When he reached the lower platform, the forest opened beneath him in a way that never stopped feeling like a secret. The platform was broad, built of heavy beams bolted deep into the old trees. It didn't sway, even in winter winds. Thomas had designed it so. He trusted his engineering more than he trusted the ground below. He moved along the wooden planks, his boots whispering over weathered boards. The small house rose from the platform like a thing grown, not built. A narrow structure shaped to the angles of branches, draped in old camouflage netting, bleached by sun and storms. The walls were thin but strong, reinforced with steel strips hidden beneath wood. Tiny windows, no wider than the span of his hand, dotted the walls at angles that allowed him to watch without being seen. Inside was simplicity. A bedroll, a metal box of tools, a few coils of rope, an old army water flask, binoculars polished from years of use, maps with corners softened by time. On one wall hung a lantern, On the opposite side, a shelf held his notebooks, where he recorded anything unusual, a habit he never abandoned. The air smelled faintly of sap and old smoke. He had built the house after leaving service, when the memories of the operation still clung to him like smoke. He had tried to live in a normal cabin on the ground at first, but the earth felt too open, too exposed. It reminded him of things he did not want to remember. The night of the explosion, the collapse of the ridge, the cries he couldn't reach in time. So he built upward, a retreat suspended above the world, where no shadows shifted behind him and no ground trembled underfoot. The house had been his refuge, his sanctuary, and eventually his only home. He sat on the upper platform and gazed out into the forest, letting himself feel, if not peace, then something close to it. For years, the view had been the same. The mountains, the long valley, the heavy lines of evergreens, nature repeating itself in rhythms older than memory. But in recent days, something about that rhythm had changed. And this morning, before he even began scanning the tree line, he sensed it again. The animals had been moving differently. Deer tracks had shifted away from their usual patterns. Wolves had rerouted their trails, leaving tangled prints in places they normally avoided. Even birds seemed restless, staying high in the canopy longer than usual. Nature reacted to disturbance long before humans noticed. Thomas lifted his binoculars. He scanned the open glade below, then the darker pockets beyond. At first, he saw only the familiar textures of winter forest, bristling branches, cold ridges, the still shadow of a fox waiting near a shrub. Everything seemed undisturbed. But then he noticed the path of trampled leaves at the far edge of the valley. Too straight, too deliberate. Deer didn't walk like that. Nor did wolves. The trail cut through the undergrowth with a strangely precise direction, widening at several intervals, as if someone had paused there. He tightened the focus. His chest grew taut. A boot print, large, deep, not blurred by wind. Someone had stepped heavily into the earth. Not recently disturbed by rain, not softened by thaw. Hours old at most. He lowered the binoculars slowly. Visitors were rare in winter, and those who came wandered the marked trails miles from here. This part of the forest was officially off limits. The terrain was too difficult, the risk of getting lost too high. Rangers only came by when necessary, and Thomas knew all the rangers. Whoever had been here did not belong. He stood in silence for a long moment, letting the realization sink into him like frost melting into the earth. Then he moved deeper into the house and pulled open his metal box. Inside were the tools he never thought he would need again. A compass, a folding knife, his old field radio, spare batteries, a small block of mirror, 2 coils of thin fishing line, and the battered leather notebook where he used to sketch suspicious signs when he still worked as a forest watchman. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a strange, old awareness, an echo of the instincts he had spent decades burying. Something had entered the forest, something that didn't move like a traveler or a hunter or a hiker, something that changed the patterns of the land without even trying. He climbed down from the platform and made his way across the ridge to examine the tracks more closely. The forest welcomed him with familiar sounds, crunching frost, rustling branches, the distant tapping of a woodpecker. But beneath the everyday noise was a hush he didn't like, the hush of something holding its breath. When he reached the spot, the tracks were even clearer. He knelt and touched the edges of the print. Sharp, crisp edges. The sole pattern was industrial, heavy, the kind worn by tactical boots rather than civilian footwear. A military-grade sole. He recognized the shape instantly. He leaned closer and sniffed. The soil around the print held a faint chemical scent. Not oil, not fuel. Something else he couldn't place immediately. He searched the nearby branches. On a bent twig, he found a small piece of dark fabric, almost invisible unless the light caught it. Nylon. Durable. The kind used on tactical packs. He straightened, feeling the old weight rise in his chest again. Someone had been here, moving with purpose, using equipment meant for extreme conditions, stepping into restricted areas without leaving a trace of their origin. He followed the faint trail for several yards. It led toward a dense cluster of pines, where the shadows thickened like a curtain. He stopped at the edge, listening. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard something. A distant hum, low and mechanical, like an engine far away. But it faded before he could be certain. The quiet returned, thick and unnatural. He went back to his house in the trees and climbed to the upper platform, his breath ghosting in the cold air. Inside his chest, something stirred, an instinct he had not felt in decades. Not fear, not anticipation. Something closer to readiness. Something waking after too long in the dark. He took his old radio and clicked it on, scanning through the channels until a faint burst of static filled the air. Then he heard it. Clipped words, spoken in a tone he knew too well. Sector clear. Moving to the next point. Marking time. Not a ranger. Not a hiker. Someone trained. He sat very still. The memories he had tried to bury pushed against the edges of his mind. The orders shouted under fire. The collapse of the ridge. The silence that followed. He shut them out. This was not the past. This was now. He turned off the radio and looked out across the vast, patient forest. He wasn't sure what was coming, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever had entered his woods did not belong. And whether he wanted to or not, he would have to watch. He would have to prepare. For the first time in many years, the house above the forest was needed again, not as a refuge, but as a station. He tightened the straps on the ropes that held the platform stable, checked the mirror angles he had once used to signal distant points, inspected the old lines he had strung between branches as primitive warning tools. Everything felt like stepping back into a previous life, a life he had hoped would stay buried beneath time. But the forest was never wrong, and the forest was telling him something was coming. He sat until dusk, watching the dark swallow the glade. When at last he climbed down and returned to his cabin, the sound returned, the low, distant hum of an engine where no engine should be. The forest was changing. Someone had entered it with purpose. And Thomas, who had spent a lifetime running from the world, understood with cold certainty that the world had followed him here. He closed the cabin door behind him and felt the shift inside the trees, as if something unseen had drawn its first breath. The forest listened, and Thomas listened back. The hunt, though he didn't yet know it, had already begun. The forest was never truly silent, yet that night it felt as if every sound were retreating to a distance Thomas could no longer measure. The cold settled heavier than usual, wrapping the trees in a stillness that deepened with each passing hour. When morning came, pale and reluctant, Thomas sensed immediately that the balance had shifted again. He climbed the footholds to the upper platform, with the stiffness of age clinging to his joints. But his mind felt sharpened by the unease that had taken root inside him. From his vantage point, the forest spread out like a vast, dark tapestry. Layers of evergreen canopy rolled across the valley, hiding more than they revealed. Frost clung to the ground below, untouched in most places, except for a single path where something had disturbed it in the night. Thomas lifted his binoculars and slowly traced the line of broken earth. It was subtle, barely visible, but unmistakable when seen through the glass. Something had moved with purpose, not wandering across the land, but cutting straight through it. He scanned the area carefully, and the cold inside his chest tightened, when he noticed a distant glint of metal. A small shape on the ridge, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. The figure paused, bent down, then straightened again, glancing left and right as if checking the perimeter. Even from this distance, Thomas recognized the posture. It was the stance of a man accustomed to scanning for threats. The way he held his arms slightly wide, the angle of his head, the way he stepped, none of it belonged to hikers or tourists. Thomas lowered the binoculars. He breathed slowly, feeling the subtle tremor of muscles that had once been trained to respond to danger without hesitation. He had hoped the tracks yesterday had been the beginning and the end of whatever presence had entered the forest, but the figure on the ridge was proof that this was no brief intrusion. Someone was searching, surveying, mapping, and they were getting closer. He climbed down from the platform with deliberate care, every movement steady, controlled. The cold air brushed his skin as he stepped onto the forest floor, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth grounding him. He walked toward the ridge, following a path only he knew, slipping between trees with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime moving through wilderness. He stopped near a cluster of ferns and knelt, examining the ground. There were fresh footprints, 3 distinct sets, spaced evenly apart, each one placed with precision. This was not a group of lost hikers. This was a tactical formation. He listened. Faintly, on the wind, he heard voices. Not clear words, but clipped tones, concise exchanges, the kind used by men who communicated in brevity. He could not make out what they said, but the cadence alone told him enough. They were trained, calm, purposeful. This was reconnaissance, not exploration. Thomas quickly retreated to higher ground, weaving through trees and using fallen logs for cover. He reached the crest above them and lay flat against the earth, listening. Below, the men moved slowly across the clearing. One carried a compact device, sweeping it back and forth. Another held a folded map, occasionally checking bearings with a handheld GPS. The third scanned the perimeter through night vision goggles, even though the morning light had already brightened the valley. "Sector 5, nothing yet," one of them said. His voice was low, but carried a firmness that resonated with Thomas's memory. "Keep moving. The markers should be close," another replied. Markers, not animals, not campsites. Something buried, something hidden, or something mapped long before Thomas ever lived in these woods. The forest held secrets that only time remembered, and it seemed these men were trying to unearth them. Thomas's heart beat steadily, not from fear, but from an old instinct rising within him. He had once trained young soldiers to read terrain, to move quietly, to anticipate danger. Now he watched men who had learned similar lessons, men who were not here for the land, but for what lay beneath it. He thought of the burrow marks he had found the previous day holes drilled neatly into the earth, covered with branches, their edges too sharp to be made by animals. Those had been tests, sampling the soil. As the men walked farther, Thomas descended the slope behind them, keeping to shadow and silence. He moved not quickly but wisely, letting the terrain disguise him. When he reached the area where the men had stood earlier, he knelt and examined the ground. The prints were deep, consistent. The soil showed faint traces of something metallic, perhaps from a piece of equipment. He followed the edge of the clearing and found what he had suspected, a small indentation where a tripod had been set up, its legs pressing deep into the frost. They were surveying the land. He returned to his treehouse before the men looped back, climbing swiftly and quietly despite the ache beginning to pulse through his shoulders. Once inside, he watched them through the slits of his narrow windows. They swept across the valley, their advance calculated. They passed dangerously close to the tree, where his lower platform remained hidden behind layers of netting and branches. but none of them looked up. They were focused on the ground, the soil, the ridges beneath their boots. One of the men paused near a fallen log. He bent down and sifted through leaves, pulling out a small device, a cylindrical core sample container. It was full of compacted earth. He examined it, then nodded to the others. They exchanged a brief, wordless gesture and continued forward. Thomas leaned back against the wall of his house, the cold wood pressing into his spine. He felt the first flicker of dread, not for himself, but for the forest. Whatever these men sought, it was not simply geological curiosity. This was methodical, coordinated, illegal. And it was being carried out with the stealth of people who did not want to be discovered. The day passed with slow tension. The men moved deeper into the forest, vanishing behind the ridge. Thomas spent hours tracking their distant progress through the echoes of broken branches, the faint shimmer of distant movement, and occasionally the soft crackle of radio static when the wind favored him. By afternoon, he had seen enough to confirm what he feared. There were more than 3. He spotted another group farther west, not walking, but guarding an area where 2 large, camouflaged shapes sat just out of view. They were trucks, or specialized vehicles, draped in netting to blend with the winter foliage. Thomas's stomach tightened. Vehicles this deep in the park were forbidden, impossible without permits. Even with permits, no one would bring such machines into protected land. These were not officials. These were not researchers. These were men who operated outside the law. When dusk settled over the forest, Thomas lit no lantern. He sat in darkness, his senses heightened by the absence of light. As the air grew colder, he heard the distant hum again, the same low mechanical drone from the night before. It was rhythmic, steady, and grew louder for a few seconds before fading. He pictured a generator, or a large piece of machinery being powered up. The sound was out of place in the wilderness. It was a wound in the natural silence. He slept little that night. When the darkness pressed too heavily on the treehouse, he climbed down and walked the forest floor, relying on the faint moon to guide him. He moved slowly, touching bark, brushing aside branches, feeling the earth beneath his palms, in places where he crouched to examine new disturbances. He found broken twigs, footprints, crushed grass where someone had knelt. And deeper into the forest, he found a small clearing with signs of use, a pile of soil scraped aside, a patch of ground that still held the heat of recent activity, and a thin metallic rod half buried in the dirt. The device was warm when he touched it. It had been used within the hour. His breath formed a pale cloud in the cold air as he looked around, trying to picture the scene. Men working quickly, quietly, using specialized tools to test the ground. Above him, a branch creaked. He listened, but heard nothing more. The forest felt heavier now, crowded with unseen eyes. He returned to the treehouse with a steady urgency. Once inside, he took out his old set of mirrors, the ones he hadn't used in years. Carefully, he adjusted them through narrow gaps to catch light from different parts of the forest. By day, they would serve as warning beacons. By night, they would reflect any sudden flashes from lamps or equipment. It was a primitive system, but reliable. He had used it long ago to spot lost hikers or approaching storms. Now it would serve a new purpose. He moved through the house with a precision he had not felt in decades, adjusting nets, tightening ropes, securing small bells between branches where they would ring at the slightest disturbance. As he worked, he reflected on the irony of it all. He had built this place to escape the world, and now it was the only tool he had to confront it. As dawn approached, the wind carried a new sound, closer, sharper, unmistakably human. Footsteps. Not the wandering steps of a lone visitor, but a coordinated movement of several men. He crouched on the platform and strained to hear. Voices filtered through the trees, low and deliberate. "Should be close. Keep scanning. Thermals aren't picking him up. Maybe he doubled back. He's here somewhere." Tracks were fresh. Thomas felt his pulse slow into the measured rhythm it had taken on in his earlier life. They were no longer simply surveying. Now they were searching. For him. He remained perfectly still, letting the forest hold its breath with him. The footsteps approached the tree line directly beneath his house. One of the men moved a branch aside and knelt, examining the ground. Another swept a device through the air, its soft beeping breaking the quiet in steady intervals. "Nothing yet," the man murmured. "Keep moving. He's watching us. Has to be." The certainty in the man's voice chilled Thomas. They had sensed him, or traced him, or simply knew enough about these woods to realize that someone like him could not ignore intruders. They were right, of course. He could not. These woods were his last remaining responsibility, his last chance, perhaps, to make up for what he had failed to do long ago. The men moved on, their voices fading into the distance. When they were finally gone, Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding, but their retreat did nothing to calm the tension coiling within him. They had come too close. They had moved beneath his sanctuary without ever looking up. But next time, they might be more thorough. When the sun rose fully, Thomas spent hours watching the forest. He kept track of every movement, every unnatural sound, every shift in the patterns of animals. The deer stayed clear of certain patches. Birds flew in wide arcs around particular ridges. Wolves howled from farther away than usual, as if something had driven them back. In late afternoon, Thomas climbed down again and moved through the forest, checking each of his old signal lines. 2 had been disturbed, not by animals, but by something larger. He repaired them, then placed new lines farther out, creating a wider perimeter. By dusk, he was certain. The men were not merely passing through. They were establishing a presence. His attempts to mislead them had slowed them down, but they were disciplined, determined, and increasingly aware of a watcher in the woods. Night settled, dark and unforgiving. Thomas returned to the high refuge of his home. He sat near the largest window, watching the forest inhale the last of the light. The sense of someone else sharing the darkness with him no longer felt like imagination. Somewhere out there, the men were preparing to return, and this time, they would come not as surveyors, but as hunters. The old man remained perfectly still, listening as the wind moved through the branches. A distant crack echoed through the valley, the sound of someone stepping on a frozen branch. Another faint voice drifted through the cold air. They were searching for him. And he, who had spent so many years hiding from the world, would now meet it again with all the caution, instinct, and quiet resolve he had thought long buried. The forest shifted around him, as if bracing for the inevitable clash. And Thomas understood, as clearly as he understood the creak of his own bones, that the time for watching was ending. The time for defending had begun. The wind sharpened overnight, carving through the treetops, as if the forest itself anticipated what the morning would bring. Thomas woke before dawn, not because he had slept lightly, but because sleep had become a temporary guest, slipping in and out of reach as the night pressed its unease against every wall of the treehouse. He lay still for a few seconds, listening to the creaking of wood, the breath of the forest, and a distant flutter of wings as a solitary bird cut through the gray pre-dawn light. For a moment he allowed himself to imagine it was just another morning in the life he had built here. Quiet, unhurried, untouched by anything but the slow passage of seasons. But the illusion broke as soon as he sat up. The forest was awake, but differently. It felt too attentive, too aware of its own boundaries, as if it knew strangers were threading through it, with intentions no one could mistake for innocent exploration. Thomas rose slowly, joints murmuring their complaints, and stepped toward the narrow window slit that faced the northern ridge. The trees below were still and colorless in the dim light, but a faint disturbance marked the earth at their base. Through his binoculars, the slight movement became clearer. 2 men crossing through the underbrush, their posture alert, their heads angled downward as they inspected the ground. Each wore a coat that blended with the winter landscape. Each carried weapons slung to their sides. And for the first time, Thomas noticed that one of them was studying the branches, not the soil. They were learning. He watched them sweep across the valley, then vanish behind a line of cedars. That meant they would likely circle back, widening their search. He counted the minutes until the forest quieted again, then descended from the treehouse, landing silently on the frost-hardened earth. His breath fogged before him, curling in soft ribbons that the wind quickly tore apart. He moved cautiously through the early morning shadows, each step measured, deliberate. The deeper he went, the more he recognized the signs of the previous night: broken branches, disturbed soil, and the faint impression of where someone had knelt to examine something. Near a cluster of moss-covered stones, he found the remnants of a small campsite. Nothing large, nothing permanent, but unmistakably used. Footprints radiated from the center like spokes, suggesting shifts in formation through the night. These men had not simply passed through. They had paused, regrouped, perhaps discussed strategy before continuing their sweep. Thomas crouched beside the prints. One set was lighter, smaller, someone agile, possibly younger. Another was heavier, deepened by someone who carried more weight in gear or muscle. He traced the lines through the leaves, noting how the lighter prints often broke off to the edges of the clearing, scouting ahead, while the heavier ones stayed central, commanding. He followed the trail until the forest shifted from pine-heavy thickets to a more open stretch of frost-bitten meadow. Here, the tracks diverged sharply. One group had gone southwest toward the lower valley, while another had followed the slope upward, toward the ridge overlooking his home. The realization curled unpleasantly in his stomach. They were dividing to surround him. Thomas stood still, letting the cold bite into his skin. He did not panic. Panic only blinded the mind and quickened the heart beyond reason. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment and pictured the forest, the way it had been for decades. He mentally traced the creeks, the boulders shaped by ancient ice, the fallen logs softened by years of moss. He thought of the places where wolves traveled during winter, the runs elk used to escape predators, the shortcuts the land offered to those who understood its language. He turned east. That direction led to the deeper part of the valley, where rock formations created natural funnels and narrow passageways. If these men hunted him, they would expect him to run north toward the ranger roads or west toward the outer cliffs. Few knew the eastern paths. It was a labyrinth of stone, roots, and sudden drops. But Thomas knew every angle, every hiding place, every echo chamber carved by centuries of wind. He moved quickly, but without haste, slipping through the thicket as the dawn light grew brighter. Frost clung to branches like shards of glass, reflecting pale blue hues that made the forest seem dreamlike and otherworldly. Yet the ground beneath him remained solid, familiar. This land had held his secrets for years. Now it held his survival. By the time he reached the eastern ridge, the sun had risen fully, painting long shadows across the valley. He paused on the crest and looked back. The forest stretched endlessly, a sea of dark green and pale frost, but he could see motioned small shapes threading between trees, moving toward the area he had left. They were on his trail again. Thomas continued forward. The wind carried the faint sound of running water, guiding him to a narrow stream that wound between two steep rock walls. The water shimmered with reflected light, and beneath its surface he could see smooth stones worn by years of patient flow. This was one of the oldest waterways in the forest, a place untouched by most hikers because of how hard it was to reach. He knelt by the stream and dipped his fingers into the icy current. It numbed them instantly, but the sensation grounded him. The land was still his ally, still speaking to him in its quiet, ancient way. He followed the stream deeper, knowing that its twists and turns would mask his tracks. He moved from stone to stone, avoiding patches of soft earth. He didn't look back until he heard a distant crunch, a misstep made by someone unfamiliar with the terrain. He exhaled slowly. They were close. The path narrowed as the rock walls rose higher. Here, the stream disappeared beneath an outcrop, becoming a hidden river that tunneled underground. Thomas stepped onto the bank and climbed the rock face to a small ledge above it. From here, he had a clear view of the ravine below. Minutes passed before he saw them. Two men, moving cautiously, scanning the ground for movement. One pointed toward the stones where he had crossed. The other nodded and raised his rifle slightly, not aiming, but prepared. They spoke in low voices that the wind carried upward only in fragments. "Fresh prints. He's above us," radioed the others. Thomas felt a tightening in his chest. They were communicating effectively. This wasn't desperation or confusion. This was coordination. Whoever these men were, they were trained to hunt in difficult environments. He backed away from the ledge and continued east until he reached a section of forest where the trees grew so densely that the sunlight barely touched the ground. Shadows layered upon shadows, creating a shifting world of shapes and silhouettes. Here, the air was thicker, colder. The trunks of the trees were massive, ancient, their bark gnarled with age. And here, Thomas knew, was the place where he had to make a stand. Not with violence. That would be suicide. These men had rifles, equipment, and unknown reinforcements. But the land favored him, not them. They could overwhelm him with force, but only if they could catch him in the open. So he would not give them the open. He would give them the forest. Thomas climbed into the trees, using footholds carved years ago during his early days of building the first parts of his refuge. He moved quietly, positioning himself between branches thick enough to bear his weight and shadows deep enough to disguise his shape. From this vantage point, he could see the narrow passage leading into the densest part of the forest. Anyone entering would be forced into single file, unable to spread out or flank. Minutes passed. Then footsteps. 3 men approached the passage. The first scanned the trees, sweeping his gaze across the branches. The second held a thermal device, checking for heat signatures. The third carried a radio. Thomas flattened against the trunk, slowing his breathing until it became imperceptible. He felt the familiar pulse of adrenaline, that quiet sharpening of focus he had once taught soldiers to control. He remained still as stone while the men stepped into the passageway. Their voices echoed softly. "Trail ends here." He doubled back. "No, look, broken moss on this side." He climbed. Checked the perimeter. But the trees betrayed them. Their eyes scanned horizontally, not vertically. Their training did not account for an old man who used the forest canopy like a fortress. Thomas waited until they passed beneath him, then descended quietly on the opposite side, slipping deeper into the woods, while they continued searching in the wrong direction. He did not gloat. There was no triumph in deception, only necessity. He moved for another hour, navigating terrain that would confuse even seasoned hikers. When he finally reached the heart of the valley, a wide opening surrounded by cliffs and fallen trees, he stopped. This place had once been a sacred ground for native tribes long before he was born. He knew the history carved into its stones, the echoes of rituals carried by its soil, and today it would serve as the last barrier between him and the men who hunted him. He scanned the area, listening. The wind shifted, and with it came the faint crackle of radio chatter. They were closing in again. Somehow they had circled the valley faster than he anticipated. He walked to the center of the clearing, feeling the weight of solitude press against him. The forest loomed around him like an ancient guardian. He spoke softly, not to himself, but to the land, as he had done countless times before. "Help me hold them off," he murmured, just long enough for the truth to be seen. The first figure appeared between the trees, then another, then a third. They emerged slowly, spreading out instinctively, trying to cut him off from every escape route. Their eyes narrowed as they recognized him, not as prey anymore, but as the one who had tracked them, misled them, evaded them. The leader stepped forward, raising a hand to halt the others. His expression was unreadable, eyes sharp, calculating. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "You've caused us a great deal of trouble," he said, voice calm. "You could have walked away." Thomas did not retreat. He stood with the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing left to lose but the land itself. "This forest isn't yours," he replied, "and whatever you're digging for, whatever you're hiding, you won't bury it under my feet." The leader tilted his head, studying him. "You're an old man," he said, "alone. What do you think you can do?" Thomas lifted his chin. "I can give the land a chance to speak before you try to silence it." The leader scoffed softly. "Brave words." "No," Thomas said. "Honest ones." The forest answered. A deep rumble echoed across the valley as a gust of wind swept through the treetops. Snow and frost slid from branches. Shifting shadows masked movement as birds took sudden flight. The cliffs trembled slightly, shaken by a distant groan of the earth. The men glanced around uneasily. Thomas backed away slowly, toward the far cliff, where an outcrop of loose stone rested precariously above the valley. Years of erosion had left it fragile, held together only by time and balance. The leader stepped forward. "Enough of this." He raised his rifle. Thomas did not flinch. Instead, he stepped onto the narrow rock ledge behind him and placed his hand on a stone he had loosened days ago while clearing debris. It shifted beneath his touch, just enough to crack the fragile balance. The earth answered again. A thunderous crack split across the valley as the outcrop collapsed, sending a cascade of rock and debris down the cliffside. Snow, stone, and shattered ice engulfed the clearing in a storm of white and gray. The men dove for cover, shouting, scrambling to avoid the sudden avalanche. Thomas slipped behind a boulder as the chaos roared through the valley. When the dust finally settled, one man was buried beneath fallen debris. Another limped toward the trees, dazed. The leader, shaken but alive, shouted orders with a desperation that replaced his earlier calm. Thomas escaped through a narrow gap in the rocks, while the men struggled to regroup. He moved quickly toward the western ridge, where the land sloped steeply upward. Shadows swallowed him, guiding him away from the clearing. By the time he reached the highest ridge, the forest behind him was silent again. Smoke like dust drifted through the air. The men had been forced to retreat, injured, confused, their plan disrupted. Thomas looked back only once, breathless, exhausted, but steady. The forest had defended itself through him, not with violence, but with inevitability. The land had always held the final say. He climbed higher until he reached a ridge overlooking the valley. The sky stretched vast above him, streaked with early evening colors. He could see the treehouse in the distance, a single structure standing tall among the branches, quiet and familiar. He began the long walk back home, Not victorious, not triumphant, but alive. The forest accepted him once more. The land that had sheltered him, challenged him, and ultimately saved him, felt unchanged, timeless. As he approached the treehouse, the wind brushed gently against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and frost. He climbed the foothold slowly, each step familiar, each movement a reminder that the world outside expected strength from him still. Inside, the house felt warmer, as if grateful for his return. He sat near the window and watched the evening settle across the valley. The forest had endured. So had he. The danger was not gone, not entirely, but he had bought time, enough for the world beyond these trees to hear his voice, enough for the truth to rise from the shadows. And as night descended, Thomas understood that this land, this sanctuary he had built with his own hands, would outlive every threat sent against it. Because the forest remembered. And so did he. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Watch more of our videos. There's always another story waiting for you. And share this video with someone who loves a good mystery.